Hello and welcome to IPSE's webinar today, which is with Pregnant Then Screwed. It's about what it's like to be a freelance mum. Before we get started, I'm Jessica Hayden, the Multimedia Content Editor at IPSE. Today I'm joined by Olga Fitzroy, who is a sound engineer and consults Pregnant Then Screwed on self-employment. Olga is also a campaigner who won the Women in Music Campaigner of the Year in 2019. I'm also joined by my colleague, Head of Research at IPSE, Chloe Jeps, who will be talking to us today about the research side of self-employed motherhood and everything that IPSE research has found in recent years about that. Before we get started and I hand over to Olga, just a few bits of housekeeping. If you can't hear us or see us, then please put a question in the questions box, which you should be able to see on your screen. We will send the recording of this video to everyone who registered for the event, and you should receive that tomorrow afternoon. There will be an opportunity to ask both our guests questions at the end of the webinar. Please put your questions as we go into the questions box that you can see on your screen, and we'll read them out at the end. We never use the full name of the person asking the question. We sometimes just use the first name, so please don't worry about being identified or anything like that. It's all fine if you just want your first name to be read out. If it's your first time an IPSE webinar, you're very welcome. It's great to have you here. We run regular events and online webinars that are free to attend for all, with really useful advice for the self-employed and freelancers. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that, and you're equally welcome. So I'll pass over to Olga now. Thanks for joining us, Olga.
Hi, thanks very much, Jess. Yes, so I'm a sound engineer in my day job and I consult for Pregnant Then Screwed on self-employment. I first got into campaigning on motherhood and self-employment after I had my son in 2015, and I realised that shared parental leave was not available to self-employed people. It made no sense to me. I started a campaign which IPSE supported as well. We've done some panels together on this. So that's kind of been my route into campaigning, and I've been working with Pregnant Then Screwed since 2018, I think. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the shared parental leave thing later. First of all, I'd really like to find out who's listening and what your situation is with regards to parenting. So I'm just going to ask the guys here to run a little poll, if that's okay. It should be coming up on your screen shortly. It's lovely. Looks like we've got lots of pregnant people, so congratulations. Lots of parents and quite a few people without kids as well, so great, really good mix. Hopefully it'll be useful to everybody, not just the parents on the call. Brilliant, thanks very much. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview, which is on the next slide, of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to introduce the charity Pregnant Then Screwed, talk about what we do, then talk about what our rights are as self-employed mums. Then I'm also going to go on to childcare and self-employment. And then, of course, the thing that we've all been battling with in the past year is COVID and lockdown and self-employed parenthood. So first, I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is who are Pregnant Then Screwed. It's a charity that was founded in 2015 by Jolie Brearley, who's the lady in the picture there. And she founded it after she was fired, shortly after telling her boss that she was pregnant. It started off as a safe space bit where women could share their stories of pregnancy and maternity discrimination. And it soon grew to encompass all sorts of other things, basically anything related to motherhood and work. And we are working to end the motherhood penalty. So what is the motherhood penalty? I'm sure quite a lot of you might have heard of it already. It's basically the penalty that women pay for having children. There's quite a lot of different ways of measuring it and statistics, but the one that always sticks in my mind is that a woman will be paid 33% less per hour by the time that her first child is 12 years old than a man. So that's almost a third less than men just for having children. And in fact, fathers don't face this penalty. There's often something called a daddy bonus. So this is what we're up against. What are the reasons for the motherhood penalty? There's a lot of reasons. So some of them might be cultural and societal. There's also direct and indirect discrimination by employers and clients. So it's not just employers of employees that can discriminate. It can also be clients of self-employed people. It's lack of access to justice if somebody is being discriminated against. And it's the consequences of lots of government policies, particularly around maternity and paternity leave and pay, but also other workplace rights, such as flexible working, which I'll come on to a bit later. So then if we could share the next slide, please. This is a kind of list of what we do now. It's gone from just being a bunch of stories about the terrible things that happen in the workplace to mums to a bunch of practical things that are there to help mums and parents navigate the world of work. So we have a free legal advice line. Just to note that they don't really specifically provide self-employed advice, but I know that IPSE do have that. So if it's specifically to do with self-employment, IPSE might be a better call for that. We also do employment tribunal mentoring, which is peer-to-peer mentoring for women going through the tribunal's process. It's not legal representation, but it is support from a woman who has been through the same process. What I also spend a lot of my time doing with the charity is lobbying politicians for changes in the law. So as I said earlier, there's a lot of issues that affect women that are the result of laws and policies made by government. So a lot of our time is spent talking to politicians, explaining what the issues are and suggesting solutions. Especially in the past year, there's obviously been a lot of changes in the law. I'm sure there's a time during lockdown where like every week there's a new rule. So that has involved a lot of work because quite often women and mothers have not been considered when these new rules are made. We also run, in pre-COVID days, we used to run live events. There's a festival called Pregnant Then Screwed Live, which had a bunch of speakers, workshops, and other sessions for people to come and listen to. So it's a really, really brilliant, fun day out. There's not just serious work-related stuff. There's also comedy, poetry. So that was a festival we used to run in the real world. We've then since then been running some online courses, the same as IPSE. So we've done something called redundancy rehab, which unfortunately was necessary due to the number of women particularly being made redundant. And we also have a program called Gendering Change, which is training for employers to make their workplaces more friendly for mothers and pregnant women. And it's a bunch of different courses they do. They do unconscious bias training, best practice, making people aware of their rights. So it's a really interesting course. They do really interesting courses, and we have a link to that at the end of this webinar as well. And finally, we're also pursuing a legal action against the government in regard to the SEISS payments to mothers, because we believe it's discriminatory, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. So next, on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about what am I entitled to as a self-employed mum. Now, the first one that probably a lot of you will be familiar with is maternity allowance. That is the equivalent of maternity pay for self-employed people. Now, how much do I get? It's about £150 a week. And how do you apply for it? There's, again, I've got a link at the end of this presentation, but you apply via the government website. You'll need your MAP B1 form from your GP confirming your due date. The slight complication with applying for maternity allowance is that they assess your eligibility by looking at your national insurance contributions. And obviously, depending on what part of the tax year your pregnancy and due date falls, you may not have actually paid enough to be eligible. So the government's workaround is that the DWP will tell you if that's the case. You can then inform HMRC that you would like to voluntarily prepay your national insurance contributions. They will then have a record of that, and send that back to DWP so that you can get your maternity allowance. It's quite convoluted, and we have had reports of it taking quite a long time, so I would really suggest getting that process started early. If you don't get those national insurance contributions recorded, then you will get your MAT allowance reduced down to £27 a week. So it is a big difference, and it's really, really worth doing. Now, the next question, working during maternity leave. This is a tricky one because the government seems to have not much of an idea of what it is actually like to run your own business. They seem to assume that you can just stop working, lock the doors, turn off your emails and go away for 9 months, and that your business will be the same when you come back. Now, we all know that that's not the case. So currently, the rules allow you to work for just 10 keeping in touch days during your maternity allowance period. However, if you want to work more, or you need to work more than your 10 days, they suggest that you inform the job centre, and they will then decide how much to reduce your maternity allowance by. Now, there's very little data on this as to how those rules are actually implemented, but it says that they might say if you work 1 day over your 10-day kit days, you might get your maternity allowance reduced by 1 day's pay. So in theory, it sounds like it wouldn't be too bad, but I think there's very, very little data on how this works in practice. So it's just something to be aware of. The other thing that a lot of people do is obviously come back to work part-time. And if you come back to work part-time during your MAT allowance period, you can still claim some maternity allowance, and they can pro-rata it down. Again, the guidance on this is completely unclear, but there was a legal precedent on this a couple of years ago. So that if you were working, say, 5 days a week before you had your baby, and if you then want to go back to 3 days a week when you're still in your maternity allowance period, in that 9-month period where you get your MAT allowance, that you can then get your MAT allowance pro-rated down to 40% of what you would have got. So it's really not clear in the guidance, but that is another option for people that are looking to sort of ease their way back into work. Now, shared parental leave is obviously sounds like a lovely idea where you can kind of share the load a little bit. Unfortunately, for self-employed families, it's quite difficult. So if you're a self-employed mum, you can stop your maternity allowance and your partner can take shared parental leave as long as they are an employee. Now, if your partner is self-employed, you will know that they will get absolutely no paid time off whatsoever, no paternity leave, no shared parental leave. So Pregnant Then Screwed have obviously been campaigning very hard to change this, but that is the situation as it is today. And then finally, discrimination at work. I think there seems to be a bit of a myth that if you're not an employee, you have no rights when it comes to discrimination. Now, the fact is that actually under the Equality Act, you do have the right to not be discriminated against at work. And that includes people that are providing a service in person. So you're not subcontracting, but you're actually working for a client. And you have the right to not be discriminated against for a protected characteristic. So in this case, pregnancy is a protected characteristic, and also maternity. So if you're within 26 weeks of giving birth, then you're also protected. The other thing to bear in mind is that if you work for a public authority, say a local authority or a government department, they have an additional duty, which is public sector equality duty. And that also offers some additional protection to not discriminate against anybody in the organisation. So again, doesn't just apply to employees. So those are two things to bear in mind when it comes to discrimination. Sorry, just lost my notes there for a second. So then I think that sort of covers your main rights. The other benefit I just wanted to mention quickly was child benefit. Of course, you are entitled to it regardless of your employment status. So again, that is probably worth applying for as well. It's about £20 a week for your first child and about £14 a week for subsequent children. So next, I am going to move on to childcare for self-employed families. So there's another slide for that. So a couple of years ago, the government actually changed the tax-free childcare scheme from vouchers to this new thing called the tax-free childcare scheme, which is actually much more helpful for self-employed people. You can pay into it via the government website, and the government will contribute £2 for every £8 that you put in. And then from that pot of money, you can then pay childcare providers. So you could pay for breakfast club, after school club, you could pay for early years for a registered childminder. So that is quite a helpful system. I think the maximum government contribution for non-disabled children is £2,000 per year, and for disabled children, I believe it is £4,000 per year. So again, it's not going to cover everything, but it is quite useful to have. Then after that, the other government help that you get for childcare is, of course, the 30 free hours entitlement. I've put free in inverted commas because we've talked to a lot of childcare providers and it doesn't cover their costs. I don't know if there's any childcare providers on this call, but if you are, I'm sure you'll know the difficulties with that. But you do get a nominal 30 free hours entitlement. A lot of nurseries, because of that, will then charge extra for food, nappies, day trips, or they might pro rata your 30 free hours. So you can't put your 30 free hours into 3 days, for example. So they're just trying different ways to get around it. But again, it is some help. There's eligibility criteria for the 30 free hours around your earnings, but it's really important to note that during COVID, the government have relaxed those criteria. So that if, for example, you would normally expect to earn enough to meet the criteria, but COVID has wiped out your income or reduced your income, you will still qualify for it. Again, it might not be that obvious from looking at the government web pages, but it's really, really worthwhile applying if you're in that situation. Now, the other childcare option at the moment is, of course, childcare bubbles that you can have for informal childcare. Now, this was something that Pregnant Then Screwed campaigned really hard on when they started doing the local lockdowns in the autumn. I mean, it feels like 100 years ago now, but it was when they started doing the local lockdowns, and suddenly there were a bunch of women who relied on informal childcare from relatives and neighbours who suddenly were facing just absolutely not being able to work at all. So over that weekend, before the rules were announced, we spent all weekend writing to every single MP in that area that was going to be affected by that local lockdown. And we managed to get the rules changed to include childcare bubbles. And that is something that has carried on throughout the various levels of lockdown. I think the government's really recognised how important it is and how many people rely on informal childcare. So we're really glad that we pushed on that. And I think certainly it's been a godsend for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people on this call. Finally, I'm just going to add a couple of other childcare tips. Again, there's lots of parents on this call who probably have got loads of brilliant tips as well. But I remember when I sort of first started going back to work, one of the things that I found really daunting was the fact that freelance work can be really irregular and unpredictable. And often you don't know that you're going to be working the next week until a couple of days before. So it felt quite a big ask to commit to, say, 5 days of nursery when you might not be able to use all of it. So one of the things that a lot of nurseries are able to do, you might put your child in for 2 days, but you book extra days if you need them. Again, it's not guaranteed, it depends on capacity, but it's just worth thinking about if you're trying to manage your finances and make decisions on childcare. The other option, again, that I used quite a lot early on before my son started nursery was signing up with a babysitting agency. So again, you can join the agency for quite a low fee, and you then get the same babysitter most of the time. You can request the same babysitter and you can just book them on an ad hoc basis. And again, you've got the security of having somebody that knows your child, but you're not committing to having a full-time nanny when you're just easing your way back into work. So they're my kind of two main tips, not COVID related, just general kind of freelance working tips. So then I'd like to actually find out what your working patterns are before I go on to talk about sort of COVID and self-employed parents. So I'm wondering if we could run the poll that's finding out whether people can work from home or not. Yeah, it's really interesting. So most of you can work from home. Like almost all of you can work from home some of the time. I mean, I'm in a similar position. I kind of work from home some of the time and occasionally need to go into work. So obviously there's a lot of financial impact of COVID on the self-employed, and I'm sure Chloe's got quite a lot of stats on that to share later on. A lot of the stuff that we've been working on has been, as well as the financial stuff, has also been on the health and safety, because the guidance has often been very unclear, very late in the day in being published. So it's been quite tricky. I mean, I just wanted to share one little stat on the childcare issue from COVID, is that we found that 44% of mums had to give up childcare spaces during COVID, and 74% felt the school and childcare closures impacted their earning potential. So it's a big financial impact. The other big impact that I don't know if you've been aware of, I'm sure that pregnant mums are keeping a close eye on this at the moment, is birth partners in hospitals. So at different stages of the pandemic, hospitals have restricted birth partners attending. In some cases, they've said they're not allowed to come to hospital at all. At some cases, they've said that they're only allowed to come in when the woman is in established labour. In some cases, women have received traumatic news on scans whilst they're on their own. So it's been really difficult, and that is one of the campaigns that Pregnant Then Screwed, along with a bunch of other charities, have been working on. We're really glad that the government finally changed the guidance to hospitals on allowing birth partners in. But again, there's still quite a lot of hospital trusts that were not paying attention to the guidance. And obviously they're all in different situations and the hospitals need to make clinical decisions. But we really felt that often this was not being given enough consideration. So we've been working really hard with a bunch of other charities to try and get hospitals, where at all possible, to allow birth partners into the labour wards and birthing rooms. The other aspect of well-being for pregnant women is, of course, the fact that pregnant women are classed as clinically vulnerable in the workplace. So for employees, that gives them some rights, but also self-employed women have some rights in this regard. Now, all workplaces must conduct risk assessments by law, and all workplaces that employ more than 5 people must publish those risk assessments. So even if you're not employed by a workplace, if you're going into somewhere, then you should ask to see their risk assessment and see what considerations they've made, so you can make a judgment as to whether it's safe or not. As a self-employed person, obviously you should be conducting your own risk assessments as well. So if the work can't be done safely, if either your own risk assessment or the workplace risk assessment doesn't seem like it's safe, perhaps you can't socially distance, there are some options for self-employed women who are pregnant. So one is you could start your maternity allowance early. So you can start your maternity allowance 11 weeks before your due date. And again, I know it's not a lot of money, but again, it's better than nothing. The other option is, if you're not in that kind of window just before your due date, would also be to claim employment support allowance. And again, the amount that you get does vary. I've got a link to it, I think, at the end of the presentation, but that's another option to get some financial support if you really feel that you can't work safely. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some of the government specific support that's come through during COVID. Now, I know there's a lot of people that have been missed out of the support. There's probably quite a few on this call. Limited company directors, I know, haven't received anything, but people who are sole traders have received the SEISS, the SACE payment, which has been really helpful. But the minute it was announced, we could see a big problem with it. The SACE payment takes an average of people's earnings over the past 3 years. Now, if you've had a baby in the past 3 years, or the past 3 tax years even, so my son is 5 and I was affected by this, then your income is going to be reduced compared to colleagues without children and compared to your male colleagues, even if your average profits when you're working are exactly the same. Now, we've spent a lot of time pointing this out to the government. We've written to MPs who have asked questions in Parliament, and the sort of response that you get has been basically that people can have reduced incomes for all sorts of reasons, including holidays and maternity leave. Now, as anyone who's been on mat leave knows, maternity leave and holidays are very, very different. So we took legal advice, and we have been represented by Lee Day and Doughty Street law firms, and we took the government to court last month for indirect discrimination, because we believe that the pregnant women are adversely affected compared to anybody, to any other groups by using this scheme, and we would like women who've been on mat leave in the past few years to be able to exempt that period from the SACE assessment so that they get a fair representation of what their income would have been like. Now, unfortunately, the judge disagreed with our view and ruled against us. So right now we're considering our next steps. I don't think I can say any more at this point, but please do keep an eye on the Pregnant and Screwed channels to find out what will happen next in this legal case, because we feel that the government just has not given adequate consideration to the situation that mums in particular find themselves in, and to reduce the income of women when they've got young children to look after just doesn't seem helpful. And we've had a lot of case studies of women who've had their incomes drastically reduced because of this ruling, and that's why we've been challenging it in court. So that's probably enough about me and Pregnant and Screwed. If you've got questions, then please keep sending them in. I'm now going to hand over to Chloe from IPSE, who's going to talk a bit more in detail about the research that they've been doing on self-employed mums. Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. So I just really wanted to give you an overview of some of the research that IPSE has been doing in the past around mothers who are self-employed. We do a lot of research throughout the year, especially last year. As you can imagine, a lot of it was focused on COVID and the impact of COVID on finances, on mental health, and a range of other things. The stats you're seeing in front of you are from our annual report that we do every year, looking at the characteristics and demographics of the self-employed sector, just to keep an eye on what's going on in the sector. And it's been particularly interesting in the last year. We've seen an overall drop of 5% in self-employment. You can see there on the screen that 14% of all freelancers are actually working mothers. And this has increased 60% since we started doing the reports in 2008. And we use ONS, government national statistics, to pull out these figures. We have seen a 1% decrease in the last year in working mothers who are self-employed. However, as I mentioned, the sector as a whole has decreased by 5%. So they are showing some resilience compared to others. And similarly, women in general have seen a 1% decrease as well. And this is in comparison to a 7% decrease in self-employed men. So women seem to be more resilient throughout the crisis than men. And Olga was touching on some of the financial issues in the pandemic. And we know from our research that it's had such a huge impact, especially on certain groups who weren't able to make use of the SAYS. So, people new to self-employment weren't able to use that. As Olga was mentioning, people taking time out because maternity leave were also discriminated against, and limited company directors as well were not able to make use of the scheme and have been left with little or no support. So we've got a lot of research around the financial impact and the mental health impact that the pandemic has had on the sector. So We often do research into sort of reasons why people become self-employed and transition from employment into self-employment. And these figures look at mothers in particular. And I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone on this call that you'll see something in one of these three top reasons that drove you to self-employment as well. So it's around greater control of your hours, choosing where you work, and having a better life balance. And there's lots of other reasons that people choose to become self-employed. And from our research, it's really good to see that for the vast majority of people, they've been pulled into self-employment because of the benefits rather than being pushed because of the lack of alternatives. So it does really seem to be a very positive way of working that can help, especially mothers, balance that time between family and work. So we've done some research looking at parental rights for the self-employed, and you can see here just a graph of how much time people took off whilst they were self-employed at the time of the birth or adoption of their child. And you can see that, quite worryingly, 8% of women took absolutely no time at all after the birth of their child away from their self-employed work, and 13% took less than 1 month. So we've put the 9 months in there as the kind of cutoff because that's what you're technically entitled to on the mat allowance. But we know that there's a whole host of people who took a lot less than that 9 months. So 69% of women took less than 6 months. There are people who are being able to benefit from the flexibility of self-employment who are taking longer, but it's really concerning that we do have such a high percentage who aren't taking any time at all. And Olga's spoken quite a lot about the maternity allowance, which is around £150 a week for those who are able to claim it. So we really wanted to find out whether women were using this, whether others were using this. We found that only actually a third of women used the full amount, the full time that was available to them. So that's 33%. Another third returned early to work for career or financial reasons. As Olga mentioned, you're only allowed 10 keep in touch days during the mat leave period, mat allowance period. And many people we spoke to felt that that wasn't enough because the government guidelines actually suggest that even working half an hour will be considered a full day of your allowance. So it's really hard to keep a business running on just the 10 days throughout the 9 months. So people were moving, were stopping taking the allowance because they needed to get back to work for financial reasons, for career development reasons. And there's a third as well who did not claim the allowance at all. And some of the people we spoke to didn't even know that it was an option for a self-employed person. So Olga also mentioned the issue around shared parental leave and this not being available for self-employed parents. And it's very much something that people we spoke to were very keen to see replicated for self-employed people, even more so, or slightly more so, that fathers really would like to benefit from being able to share that responsibility with mothers. So at IPSE, we do a lot of lobbying government as well. We've got a policy and team and a press and PR team, and these are kind of our three recommendations and areas that we're lobbying around parental rights. So the first one is we'd like to see the shared parental leave extended to the self-employed so that parents can have that equal opportunity, and that also mothers can continue, building their businesses alongside, they're having a family. Introducing statutory maternity pay for self-employed mothers. So employed people can get a statutory maternity pay for the first 6 weeks, and that's reflective. That's an amount that's reflective of their actual earnings, whereas this option isn't available for self-employed people. It is just the standard
allowance that is available. And then the third one is to extend statutory paternity leave to fathers who are self-employed. As was mentioned earlier, men get no time off at all, no paid time off at all to look after their child or spend that valuable time with their children. So that's another thing that we're really keen to see changed in the coming years or as soon as possible. There we go. That was everything that I wanted to cover. So we'll move on to questions now.
Great, thank you both. That was really insightful. We have so many questions. Please do keep sending your questions in. We'll try and get through as many as possible. So firstly, how soon, I guess this is for Olga, how soon can we apply for childcare as a self-employed worker?
Hiya. So the childcare, 33 hours is available to 3 and 4-year-olds. So, and I think it only kicks in on the term after your child has turned 3. So it's worth applying the term before that. But if your child turns 3 halfway through that term, the 3 hours will only kick in the following term.
Okay, thank you. And a follow-up question, how do I apply for the tax-free childcare scheme? Because this person who asked this didn't know that existed.
So that's on the government website. I think I had a link to it in one of my slides, but if you Google tax-free childcare government, you will find it and it'll take you through the steps.
Okay, Chloe, this might be one for you. Do you know when the next SEISS is due? It's been very quiet from the government.
Yeah, so we'll be putting all the information on our website as soon as we have all of it through. So our policy team are working hard to keep those pages updated. So do check back and find out information about that on our website, ipse.co.uk.
Great. Olga, someone asks, I only freelance 1 day a week and I'm employed for the rest of the week. I'm considering increasing my freelance days following maternity leave. Would I be entitled to any maternity allowance for that 1 day?
That's a good question. I think it is worth double checking on the government website. I don't know that off the top of my head. So yeah, I think worth double checking. It definitely has a section for people that have kind of portfolio careers, so it is worth double checking.
Last one on the childcare vouchers side of things. Someone says, my husband already claims childcare vouchers via work. Can I also apply as a self-employed worker through the government scheme or government system, sorry?
So I know that you can't claim both at the same time, but I think it's worth, I'm not 100% sure whether you can claim it separately. I don't believe you can claim both schemes for the same child. But I think, yeah, just worth double checking.
Great, thank you. And we have quite a specific question about self-employment and breastfeeding. This question says, there seems to be no rights for a breastfeeding freelancer. I had to stop breastfeeding at 5 months to go back into freelance work at 6 months. Because there was nowhere suitable for me to pump and I work to tight deadlines, why would a client book me over a male counterpart? Is there anything on this that can help someone who wants to breastfeed their child when they go back to freelancing?
So again, the Equality Act actually does make it illegal to discriminate against someone for pregnancy or maternity. So if you're breastfeeding and your child is under 6 months, that is, I believe, within the 26-week period that is defined as maternity. So if you're doing work personally for that client rather than your company doing work, and you like subcontracting, if you're doing the work personally, then you also have those same rights to not be discriminated against.
Thank you. And just to follow up on the previous question, someone's very kindly actually given some advice here. They say you can't claim on both tax-free childcare and childcare voucher schemes at the same time. They have been through this system before, so they're aware of the complications within it. That's great. Let me just find another question for you. We have so many, they're brilliant questions. Okay, if you run your own business as a company and I'm I'm the company director. I'm not sure how it will all work when pregnant and once baby has been born. This person is the only person in the company. So I guess the question is this different for limited company directors?
Yeah, so then if you're on payroll and you pay yourself some wages via PAYE, then you can again go onto the government website and look at the amount that you would qualify for as statutory maternity pay. And even some people that are perhaps not paying themselves as much may still qualify for maternity allowance. So yeah, it's worth checking on the government website. You should qualify for something.
Lots of thank yous for both of you, because there's a lot of information here that the attendees are finding really helpful. So thank you both again. We had a question sent in before the webinar started that said, have you found any novel ways to balance freelancing and childcare? And Olga, we actually recorded a podcast on this, didn't we, for the Freelance Scholar podcast it was years ago now. It was October 2019, but it feels like it could have been 2 months ago or 2 years ago.
200 years ago.
Yeah, but that's quite interesting. So there's a lot of advice out there about juggling being a freelancer and a parent. I just wondered your response to this. Are any novel ways of managing this?
I mean, right now is a total nightmare. I'm not going to pretend that there's any way of managing schools closing, because there just isn't. I think probably what I sort of touched on earlier, using things like babysitting agencies. Another thing that people sometimes do is a nanny share. If you've got another parent that lives locally, perhaps you could share childcare. And again, like organising times with your partner, if depending on what sort of hours your partner works, if you have a partner, then it can sometimes be quite good to schedule things. You know, even if it seems mad to sort of schedule things in your own home, it can actually be really helpful, and to set boundaries, especially if you're both working from home, have some hours that are your time when you're working and somebody else is looking after the child, and vice versa. I think that's really helpful.
Okay, thanks, Olga. Chloe, there's a question for you, which is about IPSE and what IPSE offers for new parents. I know Olga touched earlier on that we have tax and legal helplines for our members as well, but it might just be worth covering that.
Yeah, sure. So IPSE has a range of different things. So we've got the tax and legal advice helpline. So if ever you've got a question about anything, you can ring an expert and that they'll be able to guide you through that. We also kind of bring together people from all different backgrounds and provide opportunities for you to connect and communicate with each other via some of our social channels. So it's really good to kind of build a community with people both, you know, similar situations or entirely different situations that can share things. We run a series of webinars about a whole range of different topics. So, I mean, we've got this one today. We've had webinars around, you know, managing your mental health as a self-employed person. And we also have a lot of advice on our website that can help, you know, with all the different things that you're faced with as a self-employed person, whether it be juggling your time, you know, between childcare and work, or filing your tax return. So there's a lot out there. And as well, we offer insurances to make sure you're fully protected, so you don't have to worry about that side of things as well.
Thank you, Chloe. The only thing I'll add to that is that we are launching an advice section on the IPSE website. So again, that's ipse.co.uk. You'll receive an email with these links in there. And the advice section in March and April will be launching a freelance parents advice section where they'll have loads of information. We'll host this webinar on there so you can come back and watch it another time, and there'll be loads of information there about freelancing and parenting. We'll continue to update that. That's all we have time for. If you could, on the next slide, there's going to be a QR code which you can scan quickly on your phone before we finish. And if you could leave us some feedback, it would be so well appreciated. It really helps us to improve these webinars and to find out what you enjoy and what you want to know more about. So please do scan that and leave us some feedback. But just lastly, thank you very much, both Olga and Chloe, for joining us today. There's so much positive feedback in the questions box, so many people saying thank you. So thank you from them and from me. It was brilliant to have you both here, and hopefully we can do something about this again at some point. So thank you both, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye everyone.
Bye.